So we are going to discuss tonight the pyramid of experience in the revolving door of time. We all know what a pyramid is. We know that experiences starting from the simple reference of a tiny babe without knowledge of the world to a mature individual that has an almost encyclopedic memory is actually just a matter of computation. The mechanism of the mind and the mechanism of the soul is such for all of us, made in the similitude or image of God, that we have no difficulty, unless we wish to create difficulty, in assimilating experience. The problem with most of us is, however, that we unfortunately make too much, as Shakespeare would say, "Verily thou protesteth too much." And so human beings are prone to sputter like a fuse about to ignite a bomb, simply because our emotions are many times the cause of the fracturing of our peace. I hope you realize then that the ability of others in this time-space continuum to be able to create a disturbance in our world is not always one of intent. In other words, some people are floating around the world here in a physical body, and they are actually a person that is literally filled with an emotional whirl. They are an emotional person. And the reason why this is so is because they lack the stability that the peace-commanding presence of Jesus Christ creates. They possess the power to ignite the emotional body of others if others are not protected against the impact of their auric field. I noticed many years ago that when I sat on certain bus seats, train seats, airplane seats, or entered certain homes, that I became very disquieted. I remember traveling with a relative of mine from Minnesota, who was with the Mayo Clinic, and I was visiting him when I was about 13 years of age. And he took me to visit some relatives that I had never met before. The moment I entered that house, I wanted to run out screaming. I couldn't stand it as a child, a teenager, to even stay 5 minutes in that house, yet I was committed to an evening there. The reasons for these disquieting situations are almost totally emotional involvements and emotional impacts or incompatibilities between life streams. Some people are wholly incompatible with us by reason of karmic patterns worked out in past lives, or rather that failed to work out. And so, as some of our young people would say today, we split. And this may describe a form of mild schizophrenia. So they separate. And now, because you can't really separate from any part of life, because life is God, the karmic arrangers bring you back together again, hopefully that you will be able to work out the situation of meeting yourself coming out the door in the revolving door of time, if you know what I'm talking about. In other words, you can't get away with anything because you really couldn't enter the gates of heaven, the pearly gates, or any great spiritual state in the beyond, or any of the brotherhood temples or anything, and do it in peace if you were going to hold thoughts of vengeance against another person. And this has nothing to do with whether or not the other person did something to you that was provocative of the situation in which you are involved. There are no justifications whatsoever for the retaining of the ancestral thirst of vengeance. Let us see what Mr. Longfellow had to say about that in the Song of Hiawatha. I'll wait to see if you know anything or discover anything as we start to read it. The Peace Pipe. On the mountains of the prairie, on the great red pipestone quarry, Gitche Manito the mighty, he the master of life descending, on the red crags of the quarry stood erect, and called the nations, called the tribes of men together. From his footprints flowed a river, leaped into the light of morning, o'er the precipice plunging downward, gleamed like Ishkuda the comet, and the spirit stooping earthward, with his finger on the meadow, traced a winding pathway for it, saying to it, run in this way. From the red stone of the quarry, with his hand he brake a fragment, molded it into a pipe head, shaped and fashioned it with figures. From the margin of the river took a long reed for a pipe stem. With its dark green leaves upon it, filled the pipe with bark of willow, with the bark of the red willow, breathed upon the neighboring forest, made its great boughs chafe together, till in flame they burst and kindled, and erect upon the mountains, Gitche Manito, the mighty, smoked the calumet, the peace pipe, as a signal to the nations, and the smoke rose slowly, slowly, through the tranquil air of morning, first a single line of darkness, then a denser bluer vapor, then a snow-white cloud unfolding like the treetops of the forest. Ever rising, rising, till it touched the top of heaven, till it broke against the heaven, and rolled outward all around it, from the vale of Tawasentha, from the valley of Wyoming, from the groves of Tuscaloosa, from the far-off Rocky Mountains, from the northern lakes and rivers, all the tribes beheld the signal, saw the distant smoke ascending, the Pukwana of the peace pipe. And the prophets of the nation said, behold it, the Pukwana, by this signal from afar off, bending like a wand of willow, waving like a hand that beckons, Gitche Manito the mighty calls the tribes of men to gather, calls the warriors to his council. Down the rivers o'er the prairies came the warriors of the nations, came the Delawares and Mohawks, came the Choctaws and Comanches, came the Shoshones and Blackfeet, came the Pawnees and the Omahas, came the Mandans and Dakotas, came the Hurons and Ojibways, all the warriors drawn together by the signal of the peace pipe to the mountains of the prairie, to the great red pipestone quarry. And they stood there on the meadow with their weapons and their war gear, painted like the leaves of autumn, painted like the sky of morning, wildly glaring at each other. In their faces stern defiance, in their hearts the feuds of ages, the hereditary hatred, the ancestral thirst of vengeance. Gitche Manito the mighty, the creator of the nations, looked upon them with compassion, with paternal love and pity, looked upon their wrath and wrangling but as quarrels among children. Over them he stretched his right hand to subdue their stubborn natures, to allay their thirst and fever. By the shadow of his right hand spake to them with voice majestic as the sound of far-off waters falling into deep abysses, warning, chiding, spake in this wise, O my children, my poor children, listen to the words of wisdom, listen to the words of warning from the lips of the Great Spirit, from the Master of Life, who made you. I have given you lands to hunt in. I have given you streams to fish in. I have given you bear and bison. I have given you roe and reindeer. I have given you brant and beaver, filled the marshes full of wild fowl, filled the rivers full of fishes. Why then are you not contented? Why then will you hunt each other? I am weary of your quarrels, weary of your wars and bloodshed, weary of your prayers for vengeance, of your wranglings and dissensions. All your strength is in your union. All your danger is in discord. Therefore be at peace henceforward, and as brothers live together. I will send a prophet to you, a deliverer of the nations, who shall guide you and shall teach you, who shall toil and suffer with you. If you listen to his counsels, you will multiply and prosper. If his warnings pass unheeded, you will fade away and perish. Bathe now in the stream before you. Wash the war paint from your faces. Wash the bloodstains from your fingers. Bury your war clubs and your weapons. Break the red stone from this quarry. Mold and make it into peace pipes. Take the reeds that grow beside you. Deck them with your brightest feathers. Smoke the calumet together, and as brothers live henceforward. Then upon the ground the warriors, through their cloaks and shirts of deerskin, through their weapons and their war gear, leaped into the rushing waters, washed the war paint from their faces. Clear above them flowed the water, clear and limpid from the footprints of the Master of Life descending. Dark below them flowed the water, soiled and stained with streaks of crimson, as if blood were mingled with it. From the river came the warriors, clean and washed from all their war paint. On the banks their clubs they buried all their warlike weapons. Gitche Manito the mighty, the great spirit, the creator, smiled upon his helpless children, and in silence all the warriors broke the red stone of the quarry, smoothed and formed it into peace pipes, broke the long reeds by the river, decked them with their brightest feathers, and departed each one homeward, while the Master of Life, ascending through the opening of cloud curtains, through the doorway of the heaven, vanished from before their faces in the smoke that rolled around him, the Pukwana of the peace pipe. Now, none of you are going to believe this, I don't think, at first, but I'm telling you the truth. I did not know or have memory of the next sloka in this poem, Hiawatha. It is called The Four Winds. There it is in the book, and I give you my word, I did not remember it. You know how it starts out? I won't read it to you, but just a little bit. Honor be to Mudjikiwis, cried the warriors, cried the old men, when he came in triumph homeward with the sacred belt of wampum. From the regions of the north wind, from the kingdom of Wabasso, from the land of the white rabbit, he had stolen the belt of wampum from the neck of Mishimakwa. The reason we read this is to pinpoint for you, from the standpoint of the deity, what probably is a vital truth if the deity had ever allowed the consciousness of men to penetrate the purity of his aura. For we read in the scriptures, mine eyes are too pure to behold inequity or iniquity. We must be ever mindful then of the fact that I think was so beautifully described in Harold Bell Wright's book of long ago. It was the one in which the man fashioned a little plaque and put it on his desk, and on that plaque were written the words, "What would Jesus do?" And every morning when he got up, and every decision that faced that man, he read that statement. What would Jesus do? And he considered himself in the role of the master. And he made his decisions based on what Christ would do. And what he did, as in Lloyd Douglas's magnificent Obsession, was to spread around the idea of his concepts until, after a while in this town, the newspaper editor, the factory manager, the chief of police, everybody in the town had one of these on their desk, and the whole community was inspired by the realization of the fact that in their decisions, their own unilateral decisions, they could go to the master, and then they were in union with God, and thus in union with each other. So I think today that if we can come to the point in our spiritual development where nothing can hurt us, we are then truly being rid of our human ego. The human ego is caught so often by its tail. The tail in the revolving door of time is the stepping on the toes of the ego by others. I think of that ancient master of India who lived during the 1800s, he was a member of a yogic order, Swami Sri Yukteswarji. And I remember how that when he walked through a dense forest and was confronted by a cobra, that as he gazed at the cobra, what he did was to go with his mouth. In other words, he just looked at him and then said, "Greetings, brother cobra." Because the cobra was ready to strike, but by the power of his mind stayed upon his God, the cobra did not strike, because he called him brother. Brother cobra, I'm glad you're here. This doesn't disturb me that you're here. And so with many of the circumstances that face you in life, that are in reality tests of your own mettle, to determine whether or not you are going to make it or just vegetate. Stultify yourselves. Stay right where you are and don't go anyplace. No. Instead of that, you are determined to rise above circumstances and enter into a typical spirit of Christ victory. You're going to be an overcomer, a pillar in the temple of your God. This is most important, that we preserve such an attitude. For men and women are made up of their attitudes. And I have found out that only God's grace has permitted me to live. Only God's grace has permitted me to grow. Only God's grace is the pillar of fire that moves before me and moved before all those who have given me their light and their assistance. And so I humbly tonight bow before the presence of all of you and before the presence of my masters and those teachers who have taught me how important it is to have an absolute invincible mind, the mind of Christ, and determine that the divine sonship shall be exalted in this experience on the ship of time. Time seems to be a very strange thing, but in reality it is not. From what I have personally understood of time, time is a bisection of eternity, which is part of God. Perhaps eternity could be called all of God, except that I happen to believe that God transcends time and space. We read in Revelations, the revelations of John the Beloved that occurred on the Isle of Patmos, that someday death and hell should be cast into the lake of fire. To us, the lake of fire is the vibratory action that precedes the use of the energy that descended into it before it starts its ascending cycle. In other words, before this energy can ascend, it must descend to a certain point in vibratory awareness or vibratory action that it zeroes. It has no more momentum. And at that point there occurs an annihilation of anything whatsoever that was superimposed upon energy, memory, cause, effect, and record. Do you understand? At that point, absolute zero, the energy begins its ascent up the ladder. And as it ascends up, it comes to the apex of the development of the universal consciousness, which represents the very apex of God himself. But the nature of God is such that through the growth process whereby every soul on earth and in heaven has the right to contribute something to the growth of the universal consciousness, we find that with each succeeding movement around the spinal column of the universe or the individual, of the macrocosm or the microcosm, there is a greater height attained by the universal Godhead. so that we are entering into a realm of transcendental experience that bypasses its previous development. In other words, there is no stultification, no stopping the growth of God. And the growth of God is the growth of man also, because it is no blasphemy to make the statement that in the belt of time and on the moving belt of time, that man is God, because God so created him that man would become God. But when we understand the law of duality, we are able to understand that in the 7 days of creation, including the seventh day in which God rested, we are perceiving a drama that is capable of reenactment or being repeated in the lives of each of us until we become one with the divine experience. The seventh cycle, or the day he rested, being the completion of the pyramid or pyramid, which relates to fire. It's like the word curfew. I mean, curfew in French, for example, is couvre du feu. That is, cover the fire, is what that means. And that was the cry that went out at night from the sentries along the battlefields of France. They would say, cover the fire, couvre du feu, you know. And so it got to be called curfew. We have to understand then how the purposes of life are being served as we all contribute our wholesome experiences and as we all get rid of our negative experiences. And the way to get rid of them is to transmute them. And this is what happens through the cycle of the sacred fire and the transmuting violet flame. The transmuting violet flame carries a harmonic scale that actually runs to the level of the violet color, because it is a numerical manifestation as well as a chromatic manifestation. In other words, we start with the number 1, and we go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and when we reach the 9 figure, we are at the highest vibratory action on the chromatic scale, the color of violet, which color is then manifesting the highest vibratory action that any color can ever manifest, or the number 9. Now, when you reach 10, you have zeroed the actual numerical scale for a moment with the 10, which is nothing more than the 1 plus the 0. And you are ready to start your next movement on the vibratory action of the ascendancy. When you do this, you see, as you zero in on the 9, the violet flame is actually called into action here, this being almost automatic like a sine wave. It functions, it comes up and rises, and then the violet transmuting flame acts to zero in our scale. It's like zeroing a meter, you know, or a calculator. You have a lot of sums on the calculator, and now you want to zero it because you're ready to start a new column of addition. You push a button, and your little electronic calculator zeroes. And that is what the violet flame does for you. It takes out of you, cause, effect, record, and memory, all manifestations that are buried in that big hunk of iceberg we call the subconscious of the individual. And it gives you a nice, clean slate upon which to write. However, by reason of the factor of what we call ghost images, mankind is often able, by a mere glimpse at the negativity of others, to recreate a ghost image which then reflects into the subconscious mind and reproduces the same activity. It's like the garbage collector who goes out here on Monday morning and begins to pick up all of the garbage of the city. Then, perhaps by noon the city looks fresh and clean because all the cleanup has been done. But by evenfall, we again have an accumulation of garbage to be picked up the following morning. People don't understand that the violet transmuting flame does a tremendous job enabling individuals to be able to have wonderful experiences, but does not thereby, in other words, by reason of its efficiency and its action, does not stop the accumulative process whereby negative karma is still reflected from the subconscious through these subliminal ghost images, which are a part of the race memory and are continually being recreated until such a time as we find a certain activity taking place in the individual, where his positive momentums, the services he has built up over the years, have reached such a level and intensity that they automatically reject all images that are not of the pure Christ. The reason I'm telling you this tonight in this lecture is because we want you to understand that your life here in the revolving door of time and experience is such that you can be the victor. I read in the Scriptures that with every temptation, God will make a way of escape. I repeat it. With every temptation, God will make a way of escape. This means that if you are tempted in like manner as Christ was tempted, and these temptations present themselves to the screen of your mind or emotions, if you really want to be right, if you really want to be one with God, and you want not just to attain the power over rain and over sunshine and over human life, you're not looking, in other words, just for phenomena, but you want the most vital and marvelous, miraculous phenomena of all, the phenomena of becoming a victor over your own human emotions, so that you stand as the arbiter of these emotions, able to divorce yourself totally from the human personality, even of yourself, and stand there and say, I rule you with a rod of iron. I will not accept your foibles. I will not accept your folly. I will not accept this manifestation. Many years ago, I was in Canada, and I was there with the first mother of the flame, Louise Kinninger, who was the Apostle James in one of her embodiments. She was a frail-looking lady who had never married. She was the founder of nursing in South America. She went there for the Rockefeller Foundation many years ago and carried out an extensive activity. There is a statue of Louise Kinninger in Brazil, and I have the actual desk set of the first king of Brazil in this house, which she left or bequeathed to us. It is fabulously worth great value, and it is on display here many times. But this blessed lady, Louise Kinninger, in the narrative I'm about to recount, was in Canada when another one of our students was there, and the lady started to choke to death. Now, maybe you didn't read in the paper that one of the Kennedy women, dining somewhere out, on just a little piece of chicken, choked to death. But it's so. And people can choke to death if they're not careful when they're swallowing. Well, this lady was choking. And I looked over at this frail little lady, Louise Kinninger, the first mother of the flame, and I, who had sat beside her in many classes and heard her what seemed to be almost a little feeble decree because her voice was not very loud, looked at her as she started to decree. And she made a fiat, and I saw the visible flame come down in response to her fiat. And the woman was instantaneously healed of her choking condition, and her breath was restored, and she was perfectly all right. But this was the result of the momentum of Louise Kinninger, which momentum far belied her size. She did not look as though she would be able to do anything, but the heavens rushed in to answer. And why was this so? Every morning, every day, Louise Kinninger arose very early. She went through a ritual not like you might go through or like I might go through. She went through a ritual that was pages and pages and pages long, dedicated to the incoming children of the world, to the outgoing people of the world, to all of the people of the world, and she made calls to the angelic hosts every day for everyone. And these calls were beyond belief in their magnificence. I have a record of those calls in my own private files. Someday, when we are able to, we will publish a volume which she wrote while she was alive, telling the story of her experiences from childhood on until she finally prepared to leave this world as she was the mother of the flame. The reason I mention this is because not by might, nor by power, saith the Lord of hosts, but by my Spirit. Do not underestimate the power that you may have in secret from God. It is very great. It is wholly determined by your own desire. Not your desire to be great from the standpoint of worldly greatness, but your desire to be great as a servant. Jesus Christ beautifully illustrated this the night when he got down to wash the feet of his disciples. He put a towel around himself. He wrapped it around himself, and he got down, and one by one, he washed the feet of his disciples. He came to St. Peter, and Peter said, "You will never wash me." Christ looked at him and he said, "If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me." He says, "Lord, don't just wash my feet, wash my head and my hands also." He really wanted to be washed. He wanted to be purified. And so, in this miracle of the towel, we find that the Master taught to his disciples the great ritual of cosmic humility, a humility that is to be found in the heart. And it isn't a humility that is always upon the faith, because he who is Lord is able to seat you at the foot of the table, and when he will, he may say, "Come up higher," and raise you. This does not mean that you are raised in the level of egomania, but it means that you are raised in the level of your devotion and will to serve. So that night Jesus Christ said something that I believe should be engraved on a locket and worn by every man and every woman. He said, "He that will be great among you, let him be the servant of all." So we find in this miraculous statement, which is charged with liquid light, it is charged with the penetrating essence of the Christ consciousness. And you can feel the vibratory quality and action of that word. When the word of God spoken by any of his sons is paused and considered, or poised and considered, in the atmosphere of is it true or isn't it true, as soon as you have decided that it is true, it becomes applicable for you, because you will always find that the universal word is universally applicable. In other words, it can be carried out as a mandate by any and all, and ought to be. And so, in this revolving doorway of time and experience, is to be found the opportunity for eternal life. Unfortunately, life is not articulated by some thaumaturgic formulae, whereby, through the process of magic, we are able to utter those words that will mystically make us a God in embryo. Instead, the process is one of working out our own salvation with fear and trembling. It is not wrong to have awe of the universe. After all, the universe is a miracle place to be. The solar system is a miracle place to be. The planet Earth is a miracle place to be. Right where you are, there I am. Wherever God is a miracle place to be. And though you go to the caves of the earth, or the mountaintops, as we went to on Mount Haleakala in Hawaii just recently, or whether you descend under the ocean, or rise to 42,000 feet in an airplane, you will always find the presence of God there. Our astronauts recently, when they journeyed to the moon, have testified that there in outer space was the presence of God. And they have testified to feeling the omnipresence of God in outer space, perhaps even better than they would here on this planetary body. The planetary effluvia is very great, and I want to emphasize this for you tonight. I want to emphasize for you tonight that what I talked about in my previous lecture, the matter of the aura and its emanation, whereby what a man is, because it's caught in the word emanation. E for energy, M-A-N for man, you see. The energy of man in action. Manifestation, or man, energy through man in action, do you see? The emanation of man's energy through the human aura is what creates the human effluvia. And the effluvia is merely an accumulation of magnetic energy drawn into a mass, which mass is generally directed where the mass is negative by various forces that may be all the way from a little mischievous spirit or sprite that is ungoverned to an actual demon, as in the case of demon possession. I want you to understand then that man on this planetary body is, if he does not use his tube of light or any form of protection from God, he is many times subject to the penetration or the involvement of those energies that are negative. This accounts for why people sometimes go through negative experiences. I can cite some of these experiences and tell you exactly how they work. When people first come in here, as a rule, one of the greatest anathemas to them, in many cases, is the decrees. First of all, they seem to be repetitious, and people wonder just what is the value of that repetition. And also, they are the most efficacious means that I know of from a mantric level whereby an individual can create an invocative effort, drawing from the Godhead or living, tangible, cosmic beings, the energy that will actually free them in their personal world from those individual focuses of negativity that they had previously established in themselves. When you understand this as it was intended to be understood, you'll recognize it for what it is. You see? In other words, you will see that this is the human effluvia. This is the accumulation of mass conscious energy. And when that energy is drawn through the drinking straw of the individual monad, and it is negatively qualified, the demons act to increase the flow of that negative stream as an inroad into the body and conscious awareness of the individual, so that the drinking straw becomes the culvert. And people never know, when they start a negative action, just how big that little tiny cloud the size of a man's hand can be until it obscures the whole heavens. I will give you one amusing little anecdote concerning this, perhaps more. There was a lady in England who received, and England, by the way, is one of the most treacherous countries in the world from the standpoint of witchcraft. There is so much witchcraft action in England that I would hesitate to tell you the story of our going across the North Sea and what happened to us. It was just unbelievable. They didn't want us in England when we went there. But anyway, this woman in England, she wrote a letter to us because she'd received the pearls of wisdom for quite some time and thought they were wonderful. This is what she said in her letter, asking us to never send her another pearl. She said, "The masters do not make mistakes." That's how she opened. Then she said, "On a certain page of a certain pearl, you forgot a semicolon. I don't want the pearls anymore. That's the end. If the masters had written them, there wouldn't be a missing semicolon. That's it." So many people lose sight of the fact of agency. After all, some of the old prophets of Israel, probably in their prophecies, and the way they said them might not have been acceptable to our modern English teachers. And I'm not belittling the English teachers. I think we should all strive to master the language. This is a very beautiful language. It is somewhat like our ancient Censar language. And that is why I have always loved the English language very much, although I believe other languages have and retain very useful purposes. To illustrate this, I might say that take the word government. Many of you have heard this before, and some haven't remembered. G stands for God, and O-V-E-R means God over men, with a T on the end. Government. It means God is over men. It also means God's apostrophe over men, which means those who have elected to fulfill the administration of the laws of this temporal world, or jurisprudence unto man. We should understand then the common techniques that are embroidered into our language as patterns. These have some very valuable references to the soul, because language and speech is identified with the soul, and all they needed was a phase synthesizer from the inner levels to be able to just simply phase at the Tower of Babel the individuals that they wished to speak one language to another. In other words, they could just alter the brain's receptor mechanism so that only certain ones could understand each other, and they went all off in one direction, because the speech of man was confounded by the angels, who were masters and still are of control over man's consciousness. I can assure you that occasionally somebody shakes their fist at God and says, "I dare you to strike me dead if you exist." And every once in a while we hear of someone that is struck by lightning, right when they're doing such a thing as this. But of course, I think the biggest problem here is that some people do this with seeming impunity. In other words, they get away with it. But do they really? Not really. I think it is very horribly unwise. I think one of the men here in the second row, I won't tell which one he is, but he told me one time in private, and therefore I'm not going to give his name, but he told me one time that they created what they called a magic mirror and took it to a cemetery to start to use it. And they told me that their automobile was suddenly lifted up by unseen hands, and the car was raised to about a 2 or 3 foot level and then dropped down, and all the kids that were in that car were just about scared to death and out of their wits by reason of it. So we get the idea, don't we, that there are quite a few things that are strange things in this world. But strange things don't necessarily produce God consciousness. Do you understand what I mean? In other words, we can live in the world where all our life we spend in ferreting out, like Believe It or Not by Ripley. We're going to find out what is a little different in life. Why do people walk on hot coals with impunity? And why do other people get burned just horribly by some simple little thing? Well, I could tell you a very interesting story. If my wife is not near here, it's on my wife. She's liable to tell one on me. But in one embodiment, it was my embodiment when Elizabeth and I were the first king and queen of France. I was Clovis and she was Clotilde. And at that time, she had an uncle who had more or less did something to her that was pretty terrible. I won't tell you what it was, but it was pretty terrible. So she was a pretty fierce gal, but a very wonderful one. And she wasn't going to let this man get the better of her. So she got a bunch of foxes, and she got them all together and then tied their tails together. And then she had her servants tie a little pitch torch between each tail, and she put these in her uncle's wheat field. And naturally, they burned the wheat field to the ground. Well, this happened many, many hundreds of years ago. And so, as we were on our way to the first conference of the Summit Lighthouse in the state of California, about the day before, she had a pot of hot grease. And the karma waited all that time before it ever got to her. And so she had to pay for that with these foxes, you know. I could tell a few stories on myself, too. But it's so much more fun to tell them on someone else, isn't it? But anyway, I sound almost like one of the screw tape letters. Believe me, I'm not. But anyway, she had this pot of hot grease in her hand, and she poured it where the first finger and the thumb come together. And the flesh was literally boiled in oil, as they say. It was boiled in oil. And the huge welt that came up looked to me as though she would be scarred for life. So we got on the train. We went to California by train that time. And as we were traveling across the country, what actually took place was that in 3 days and 3 nights, that complete scar disappeared. Because, you see, she was engaged in a divine act of friendship with God. And therefore her karma was returned to her briefly. And this is quite similar to the story that is told of Lahiri Mahasha's presence at a sacred Vedic ceremony, when the great master Babaji appeared to him, seized a burning brand from the fire, and took one of the gentle little chelas that was standing there and burned this chela on the shoulder so that a very severe burn resulted. And of course Lahiri turned to him and said, "Sir, how cruel!" You know how people are. It's the same old story with the people breaking the precious alabaster ointment on Jesus. And then they said, "How dare this woman break this ointment? Why didn't she sell the ointment and give the money to the poor?" The master said, "The poor you have with you always," because he knew the law of karma. But he says, "Me ye have not always." And so it was the same situation here with Lahiri. Lahiri said, "Sir, how cruel, how terribly cruel that you'll do a thing like this." And the master swiftly fixed his eyes on him and he said, "Would you rather," he says, "have him burned to death before your very eyes, as his karma had decreed?" But he says, "By a little suffering is the law served." So you see that there is an element of mercy in this revolving door of time, and that we can certainly look for mercy if we shew mercy. We read that God is shewing mercy unto thousands of them that love him. And so the key to our survival is to love God not just at the spiritual level as of the impersonal God or the omnipresent Spirit, but to love God also in your fellow men. This does not mean that you suddenly open your pocketbook, pull all the moths out of it, and all the extra change you have and give it to them and say, "Here, I realize you need some money, so you can have this money." No, I do this occasionally by almost what seems whimsy. Just the other night, the master spoke to me and said, "I want you to buy a hunk of that." I'm getting rid of my good karma by this, but that's all right. I'm not concerned about the good karma. I believe that God knows the motivation for my telling the story. The master told me to buy a hunk of that amethyst that we have out there and give it to one of our students here, because he couldn't afford it, this particular student, and he's done a lot of wonderful things for the summit. A nice person. So the master told me to do that. I never hesitated, because I haven't forgotten the time I was in the streets of Arlington, Virginia, driving along past a store that sells pictures, an art store. And that picture on the back there by Hitchcock of Mary and the child going in the flight to Egypt, and you can see Joseph in the background, was hanging in the window. And it cost $50. And at that time, $50 was to me as scarce as hen's teeth. And so I looked at the picture and I hesitated a moment, and I said, "You want me to buy that more?" I said, "Who for?" He said, "For your wife, for Elizabeth. I wish to give her this as a present." I said, "You wish to give her as a present and I'm paying for it." "All right, I'll do it." I went in without any further hesitation. I bought the gift. I took it back to the house and I presented it to her on the birth of Sean. Much to my amazement, the sun never went down that night before someone came to me and said, "Here's $50 as a gift." And I have seen this repeated over and over and over again. One time somebody here on the staff got $20 from me. They never asked me for it. The master told me, "Give him $20. So I gave him $20. That night again, $20 appeared from nowhere. So I am convinced that Maury always pays his bills. Go and do thou likewise.